Hello there and welcome to Discover History, the podcast where people from all walks of life discuss the topics they are passionate about. In today's episode, we will be discussing Constantine the Great's conversion to Christianity and the impact that had. Joining us is Kate Loadman, who specialises in classical studies. Hello Kate and welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So we'll just jump right in and let's begin with Constantine's religious background. So was Constantine actually raised a Christian?
No, Constantine was a pagan. The Roman world had been pagan for many hundreds of years, and the pagan culture was deeply ingrained in the Roman state and society, which made Constantine's eventual conversion to Christianity really quite shocking. Constantine particularly favoured the sun god as his pagan god that he worshipped all the way to the end of his life, even when he adopted Christianity as well.
What was Constantine's early childhood like?
So Constantine was born in modern-day Serbia in the Balkan region of the Roman world, which had at that point produced several soldier emperors, they're known as, who went on to lead power in a military way. And his father was one of these men. So Constantine's father, Constantius, was one of the kind of four rulers of the empire at this time, known as the tetrarchic system. So his father was a military leader in this way, and so Constantine grew up in that military world, seeing his father lead, and unfortunately he hoped to take his father's position when he died, but he did not. No, he hoped to take his father's position. He hoped to be promoted to his father's position as Caesar, but his father didn't select him for this. So he took matters into his own hands to gain power, declared himself one of these rulers, and that's how he got to be in the administration of empire.
Did Constantine's conversion take place before he became emperor? And if so, was it actually part of his campaign?
No, it was not part of his campaign. Constantine had been more open to Christianity than some of the other tetrarchic rulers. He hadn't persecuted Christians as strongly as some of his other contemporaries, but he hadn't ever been Christian or openly pro-Christian himself. He'd just been a bit more tolerant than others. His conversion happened during his attempt to gain sole power of the empire, whilst he was trying to eliminate his rivals, the other men who were on the scene. And one of these men, Maxentius, Constantine was about to battle him in Rome in 312, the Battle of the Milvian Bridge. And it was at this point that Constantine had a deep religious experience, which saw his following conversion. The religious experience itself is not exactly certain, but that's when it happened.
Could you explain this religious experience that he had that made him convert from paganism to Christianity?
So the sources are a little bit unclear on this, but it was some kind of religious vision. The source by Eusebius, who was a Christian bishop at the time of Constantine, says that Constantine saw some kind of shining cross in the sky, which led him to think this was a sign from the Christian god that he was going to help him in this battle. The other source is Lactantius, who wrote about 20 years earlier, and he says Constantine also saw some kind of divine sign from the Christian god. And then when Constantine went on to win this battle, it confirmed his faith that the Christian god was looking over him and leading him to victory and success. So that's from that moment onwards, he put his faith in the Christian god and it took him forwards.
It gives the impression that Constantine's interpretation of these signs and omens relates to his pagan heritage. Is he now putting them into a Christian context?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, pagan culture and religion was really just so embedded in the whole Roman world, and Constantine had been brought up in that environment, so it definitely definitely did stay with him even when he adopted Christianity as well.
It makes you wonder what kind of impact this would have had on the army. You know, you wake up one day before the battle and the boss is like, look lads, this is what we're painting on our shields.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that they had to actually paint the cross on their shield, didn't they? So yeah, you'd be like, no questions asked, just go with it, yeah.
What impact did this conversion have on his family and the royal court?
So Constantine raised his sons as Christians, which meant that the future emperors were brought up as Christians. So that was the direction that the empire was going to follow after Constantine himself had left power. The Roman aristocracy around him as well, his royal court, obviously had the closest contact with him. So they followed his example and adopted Christianity as well. And these were the most influential people of the Roman Empire. So when they chose to follow Constantine, kind of everyone else did kind of follow the crowd.
Could it be described as a top-down conversion of society?
In one sense, yes, but Christianity had obviously existed before Constantine as well. So it was kind of a bit of both, like a coming together from grassroots on the one hand, this minority Christian community, and then Constantine at the top, which brought it into the mainstream.
Would you consider his conversion to Christianity as genuine or politically motivated?
I think it was a bit of both. I think that definitely there was some political pragmatism in there, because Constantine fought very hard to get to his position. He wasn't going to sacrifice that easily, I don't think, for the sake of a religion he just adopted. So I think that every move he made, he had his power and his position as emperor in mind. Yeah, and Christianity at this time, it was a minority religion, but it was gaining some attention as well. It was becoming a little bit bigger, a bit less on the edges of society.
Yeah, so that's quite interesting, because I think there is a pragmatic political angle to his conversion. And I think from my perspective anyway, or part of it, because I think it's a bit of both as well, but I think from a political perspective, one, it sets him apart from his three rivals who are all pagan. And then also it gives you a base of support within each territory of your rivals, which gives you potential allies going forward.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we're talking about him today because of this decision he made. So it gave him a huge legacy.
So what do you think in terms of his actual genuine religious beliefs?
I mean, he certainly continuously throughout his reign promoted Christianity, and in many different spheres and apparatus of the state. It wasn't kind of some brief obsession he had that died down. It was sustained, he was committed to promoting it. So there's definitely that in his favour. He also got involved in church disputes and kind of religious debates between different sects, they got quite heated at that time, I think. So the fact that he took on that interest in theology as well suggests that it was more genuine.
One of the most famous of these debates was the Council of Nicaea in 325 CE. Can you tell us what happened here?
So the Council of Nicaea, they decided on the Nicene Creed, which is the Catholic theology that still stands today. That was obviously a monumental moment for the church's direction, and Constantine participated in that.
Our main source for this event is the author Eusebius, whose account has not been without controversy over the centuries. What can you tell us about Eusebius as a source?
Eusebius was the bishop of Caesarea in the Middle East. So he was a big Christian figure at that time. He was an apologist, a defender of Christianity, and we have a lot of his texts. He's definitely the foremost source for Constantine. He wrote a biography of him, and also other writings, a history and other biblical treatises.
He's quite a controversial source, because throughout the centuries it's kind of swung back and forth between, is he reliable, he's unreliable, and I think the orthodoxy today is trying to be like, oh, he's quite reliable again.
Yeah.
But as you said, he was an apologist. If he maybe came to these writings with his own agenda in mind, and one of the big theories is maybe not Constantine's words, but it's Eusebius's words, and it's his idea of kingship based on the Bible and Greek kingship.
Yeah, the kind of divinely appointed emperor on earth, like Constantine would be the divinely appointed emperor on earth, kind of mirroring the divine hierarchy with God as the ultimate ruler. So, yeah, I mean, it massively justifies Constantine as a ruler if he's been personally selected as like the steward of earth by the Christian God. Yeah, and as you said earlier, these people who had suffered through the persecution and then Constantine comes and promotes their religion, they're going to hugely cling on to that, and that's definitely evident in Eusebius, isn't it?
Well, that's it. And because, as you said, it's a divine appointment, it probably generates a lot of loyalty and support from the growing Christian movement at that time. So do we think that Eusebius is maybe historically accurate or to a certain degree?
I mean, with the sources, with any source, it's never 100% really, is it? But Eusebius in particular seems to be pretty dodgy. I mean, I think it was the ecclesiastical history that he wrote first, and in that account, there was no mention of Constantine's vision at the Milvian Bridge. And then when he wrote the biography 25 years later, like there it was. So that's a huge inconsistency.
And I think what's interesting as well, as you said, it was 20 to 25 years later. And he claims that Constantine gave him this account while they were, I don't know, having on a coffee break or something during their heated debates. We now have, as you said, it was a vision, but Eusebius is now added in a dream as well. So the whole conversion story has kind of grown, and you start to wonder, I wonder if Constantine as well was playing to his new audience.
It definitely seems to have snowballed, doesn't it? Like, and this revision of history that Eusebius has come up with, you've got to definitely treat it with some caution.
So what do you think was like an immediate impact of his conversion? Do we know anything about his daily life? Did it change in any manner?
I mean, the primary sources don't really mention much about Constantine's personal habits or religious patterns, I guess, and rituals that he'd do in his daily life. So that's in itself quite surprising, maybe, that doesn't make more mention of this. He didn't even get baptized until right before he died. So he didn't kind of personally commit to Christianity in that way. It seems to have definitely been kind of empire-wide structural changes that provide evidence for his Christianity rather than his own personal commitment.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point, because I think as a biographer, you're writing about somebody's life. I mean, this might be a more modern perception, but we would think that they would talk about what they got up, well, what they've done on a daily perspective as well, and how that changed throughout their life. And somebody who's writing from a Christian perspective, wanting to promote a Christian or an emperor who is Christian, you would think if he was like going to church 5 times a day, he was praying and all this kind of stuff, he would be putting that out there as a model for how people should live. I think what's interesting as well is the baptism right at the very end of his life. So a lot of people, or should I say, a lot of historians throughout history have associated this event with his need to receive salvation for the murder of his family, and especially his son Crispus. Can you tell us anything about this?
Constantine thought that his wife was sleeping with his son Crispus, and so he had them both killed, including he made his wife, he locked her in a bathroom so that she suffocated. So it was pretty brutal.
Yes.
Not Christian behavior at all. That's also been looked at as a possible cause of his turning to Christianity, because he was told that the pagan religion could not absolve him of those sins. Only Christianity would allow that, the total salvation of the soul in the afterlife. Yeah, that's been pointed out. I think it was his nephew, Julian the Apostate, who later became emperor, who really bigged up the murders of his wife and son, obviously, because they were not keen on each other at all.
And I think it's quite interesting as well because, as you said, a future emperor has kind of done his propaganda machine. So we're not quite sure whether these rumours of them sleeping together is true.
Yeah.
I think it starts to build up a bit of a picture of Constantine, of a man who has visions and dreams and is maybe a bit paranoid, and you start to question, like, I wonder what his psychological makeup was and how that then impacted his rule.
Yeah, it makes him seem, not the most steady of people and quite protecting his own position at all costs, which again maybe feeds into the pragmatism, like political adoption of Christianity. It all seems to circle back to how he wanted to retain power.
You mentioned that these changes were structural and empire-wide. Can you tell us about some of these changes that occurred?
Constantine began protecting and promoting Christianity through legislation. As soon as he'd won at the Milvian Bridge, so he gained power of the western half of the empire, the Edict of Milan, which was in 313 CE, came out in collaboration with the eastern ruler, Licinius, who was still ruling that half of the empire. And that protected Christians, gave them the freedom to worship, meant the restitution of Christian properties, which had been confiscated from them during the persecution. So just totally legitimized Christianity in a way that it had never been before, especially during the persecutions. That was the first major change that he put in place at the first opportunity as well.
Well, that's it. And that would have gained him a big bit of support. I think one of the changes I found really interesting, which kind of changed the physical landscape, was how he excluded the clergy from civic duties. The aristocracy had to pay for the upkeep of public spaces within their towns and cities. And I think this started to change like the physical landscape, because what you see is the wealth coming away from paganism and towards Christianity. And I think Constantine done that in a legal aspect as well, where he allowed the stripping of pagan temples to pay for new churches.
Yeah, I think he even melted down the gold in the pagan temples, so just totally no respect anymore for the pagan tradition, and then used that gold to rechannel it back into the church to fund the building of new physical church buildings, which would then dot the landscape of the empire all over in the way that the pagan structures had. So it was a real physical representation of the shift that was going on. There was an interesting read by someone who saw the churches as almost like victory monuments showing the success of his policy, which I thought that was really interesting.
Part of his speech at the Assembly of Saints in 325, had that kind of be seen as an indication of his desire to see all the empire's inhabitants converted to Christianity?
Yeah, in this speech, Constantine certainly, he says he wants people to convert to Christianity, and he condemns paganism quite harshly. He's surprisingly explicit, actually, compared to the rest of his tolerant policies, maybe. So, yeah, but this was delivered in Nicomedia around kind of 325 time. So Constantine was quite established as a pro-Christian emperor, and the tone is strongly Christian. It goes into theological detail as well. So again, seems a bit more genuine in the sense that he engages with the Christian religion a bit more, the actual theology behind it. So yeah, I'd say it does seem to be pro-Christian.
It sounds like he's obviously, as you said, he's quite confident in his position by now. He doesn't have any real rivals. Yeah. So do you think it's perhaps that now he's in that position, he's like, I can actually do what I've always wanted to do all along?
Yeah, it may well be, yeah. And I think it was delivered to a Christian audience as well. So he had to be maybe less defensive than in other situations where he would have been catering to more of a mixed bag. He knew that it was going to be well received if he spoke of his desire for conversion to Christianity.
He condemned paganism quite strongly. Do you think that had an impact on pagans throughout the empire, or more in terms of the aristocratic pagans?
It seems to have been a lot more the aristocrats that followed Constantine in converting, because I think it's so easy to forget how big the Roman Empire was and how little communication there was, especially in the rural areas. So, if this was in the Near East, people living in the what's now like French or German countryside, they're not going to know that he's delivered this speech. So it was definitely the aristocrats that were more in his circle and more in touch with the views of the emperor that would have taken this on board rather than the populace as a whole.
So I wonder if he kind of thought it would kind of be like a pincer movement in the sense that Christianity was a grassroots movement. Mm. And then if you've got the powerful part of it as well, that eventually these two movements would eventually change the rural landscape towards Christianity. Do we have any evidence that actually happened in his lifetime?
I think it was more later, wasn't it, that Christianity became mainstream enough that it did penetrate the countryside. Before that, it spread Rome first, the traditional, heart of the Roman Empire, then the other major cities, and then as time went on and the Christian policies continued under the later emperors, it really took a hold and conversion became quite common.
So it's kind of like he's laid the foundation for what would happen preceding his death.
Yeah.
With the influx of the aristocracy into the church, I think Eusebius actually notes in his accounts that he complains that they're not real Christians. So do you think that for the first generation of the aristocracy that went over, it was more, this is a financial and probably a political benefit rather than a religious conversion?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, as Constantine was channeling more money and more power into the church, it became more attractive for the upper classes to associate with that and get in on that, basically, and boost their own position. He definitely favoured soldiers in the army if they were Christian for promotion. So it follows perhaps that he would have preferred Christians in his court or in the courts of the later emperors. So it wasn't just Constantine that was being tactical, I think.
I think as well, one of maybe the other cultural changes that have come from this, as we had said earlier, the aristocracy paid for the upkeep. So this could be things like your local amphitheatre or your public baths, and which are such a iconic symbol of what it is to be Roman. But with as you're saying, with the flight over because of financial and political reasons, do you think Constantine's conversion was actually the catalyst for Rome losing these iconic symbols of what it meant to be Roman?
Yeah, I mean, weren't gladiatorial fights outlawed later on because it wasn't seen as Christian? So that was the major purpose of the amphitheatres, was the gladiator fights to be held in there. So if you take away their purpose on a Christian basis, then yeah, they're going to crumble. Which is really interesting how those features of the empire that emerged in the Republican period and had lasted for hundreds of years, then began to fade away in favour of basilicas and chapels and church structures instead.
I always wondered, I wonder how the populace felt of that. It's like us living in a city. It's like if they took away all our entertainment, it was like, but you can go to church.
Yeah.
Would you really be, how happy would you be? But again, it suggests that by the time they brought these things in, that they must have had enough mass support that they could get away with it.
Yeah, and how you said the aristocrats were accused of not being proper Christians. I think that happened a bit with the lower classes as well, didn't it? When they'd be kind of officially Christian and celebrate holidays that had been pagan but were now labelled Christian. And it was like the line was really, really blurred, really. Like they were just there for a good time, not for the theology either way. Yeah.
That's it. They wanted to keep up their celebrations and festivals, and that's live with us today. Christmas, Easter, all these kind of celebrations are based on pagan holidays that were transformed into Christian holidays to keep the populace, on side. So what do you feel were the long-term impacts of his conversion?
Constantine obviously was the first emperor to promote Christianity and legitimize it as a religion in the Roman Empire. And it was his decision, that pivotal change, that meant that the future emperors followed his lead and really consolidated those changes. These emperors after him, Gratian and Theodosius, they were not pagan at all in the way that Constantine kind of eased them into it with his blended religion. They were Christian only. They got rid of the paganism of the Roman Empire. They stopped the state subsidizing the priestly cults in Rome. The tolerant policies ended. So what Constantine introduced, they continued very strongly, and it meant that even after the Roman Empire, Christianity was so embedded in the culture of those places that it continued right the way down to today, pretty much.
I think it's interesting as well, like other legacies that we live with, simple things like having a Sunday off. I think it was Constantine introduced, a Sunday as a holiday, which I think must have been quite revolutionary back in his period as well.
Yeah. It's really interesting how it's completely continued. Christianity was, when you think of periods like the medieval period or the kind of early modern period, Christianity is the defining feature a lot of the time. And it's Constantine started it basically, which is why he's just so interesting, I think, to a lot of historians still.
Well, Kate, thanks for coming on and discussing Constantine's conversion. It's been a fascinating subject. And that's it for this week. If you would like to join the discussion, or have any questions, or would even like to be a guest on the show, you can email us at discoverhistorypodcast@gmail.com. You can also find us on social media at Discover History Podcast, except Twitter, which is at History Podcast. Thanks for listening.